In 1692, a pocket watch stopped ticking at exactly 11:43 in the morning. Its owner never wound it again. He was dead before he had the chance. 267 years later, in 1959, a diver named Edwin Link pulled that watch from the mud at the bottom of Kingston Harbour, Jamaica. It was still readable. The hands frozen at the exact moment a city died. The city was Port Royal, and for a few decades in the late 1600s, it was the richest, most dangerous, and most depraved settlement in the Western Hemisphere. A place where pirates drank rum from casks rolled into the street and forced every passerby to join them. Where a man could spend 3,000 pieces of 8 in a single night and wake up broke on the beach the next morning. Where 1 in every 4 buildings was a tavern or a brothel. Where the parrots, according to one Dutch visitor, had learned to drink ale alongside the drunks. And then, in less than 3 minutes on a Tuesday morning, 2/3 of it slid into the Caribbean Sea and never came back. To understand how Port Royal became the richest city in the New World, you have to understand what England needed it to be. In 1655, an English fleet under Admiral William Penn and General Robert Venables sailed into the Caribbean with orders from Oliver Cromwell to seize Hispaniola from Spain. The mission was a complete disaster. The Spanish garrison drove the English off with heavy casualties. Humiliated and desperate, Penn and Venables turned south and attacked Jamaica instead. Jamaica was lightly defended. The Spanish fled into the mountains and eventually off the island entirely. England had its Caribbean colony, even if it was not the one they had wanted. The problem was holding it. England had no standing army in Jamaica. The Spanish could return at any time with a larger force. The French were expanding through the Caribbean. And England's treasury, depleted by civil war, could not afford to garrison a distant island with professional soldiers. Governor Edward d'Oyly found a solution that would define Jamaica for the next 40 years. He invited pirates. Specifically, he invited the Brethren of the Coast, the same loose fraternity of buccaneers who operated out of Tortuga. He offered them something no other colonial governor was offering at the time: a safe harbor, legal protection through letters of marque, and the right to keep their plunder as long as they aimed it at Spain. The deal was straightforward. Defend our island by making the Spanish too busy protecting their own ships and settlements to attack us. In exchange, you get a home port, a market for your stolen goods, and the crown looks the other way. The pirates came, and they brought their money with them. Port Royal sat on the tip of a long, narrow sand spit called the Palisadoes, stretching out into Kingston Harbour like a bony finger pointing at the open sea. The harbor was deep and naturally sheltered. The location was perfect, sitting at the crossroads of every major shipping lane between Panama, Cuba, Hispaniola, and the open Atlantic. A pirate operating out of Port Royal could intercept Spanish treasure ships heading north from Portobelo, French merchants sailing west from Martinique, or Dutch traders moving south through the Windward Passage. Every target in the Caribbean was within reach. The city grew fast. By the early 1660s, 200 buildings had sprung up around the original fort. By 1692, there were over 2,000 buildings crammed into 51 acres. The population reached somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people, making it one of the largest English cities in the Americas, rivaling Boston. 213 ships visited the port in 1688 alone. There were 4 goldsmiths working full-time to handle the volume of stolen treasure flowing through the economy. 44 licensed tavern keepers served a population that was, by every contemporary account, perpetually drunk. Port Royal did not look like other colonial cities. There was no town square, no grand church at the center, no orderly grid of streets. The buildings went up wherever their owners decided to put them, packed so tightly together that you could touch the walls on both sides of some alleys with your arms outstretched. Brick houses of 2, 3, and even 4 stories were built directly on the sand, on foundations that were never designed to hold them. Some buildings sat on pilings driven directly into the harbor floor, hanging over the water. The city had piped water, which was a luxury in the 17th century Caribbean, but it also had almost no sewage system, and the smell was famous. The wealth was staggering. Port Royal was not just a pirate port. It was a commercial hub where the legal and illegal economies were so thoroughly intertwined that nobody could tell where one ended and the other began. Enslaved people were bought and sold on its docks. Sugar, tobacco, and indigo flowed through its warehouses. Legitimate merchants operated alongside smugglers and fences, and most of the so-called legitimate merchants had privateering investments on the side. One historian noted that, one way or another, nearly all the propertied inhabitants of Port Royal had an interest in privateering. The coins that flowed through Port Royal came from everywhere: Spanish pieces of 8, English pounds, Dutch guilders, French livres. The city was so flush with hard currency that, unlike most colonial towns which relied on barter, Port Royal operated on a cash economy. You paid for your rum in silver. You paid for your supplies in gold. The goldsmiths, and there were 4 of them working full-time, were kept busy melting down stolen Spanish treasure and recasting it into forms that could pass through legitimate channels. The privateering economy alone dwarfed the income from sugar plantations. When Henry Morgan sacked Portobelo in 1668, the plunder from that single raid was valued at £75,000, more than 7 times the total annual value of Jamaica's sugar exports. Each of the 300 men who accompanied Morgan came home with at least £60 in their pockets, the equivalent of 2 or 3 years of wages for a plantation worker. They spent it all in Port Royal. The historian Charles Leslie, writing his History of Jamaica, described what happened when these men came ashore. Wine and women drained their wealth to such a degree that some of them became reduced to beggary. They had been known to spend 2,000 or 3,000 pieces of 8 in one night. One gave a strumpet 500 to see her naked. They used to buy a pipe of wine, place it in the street, and oblige everyone that passed to drink. The man who towered above all others in Port Royal was Henry Morgan. Welsh by birth, Morgan came to the Caribbean as a young man and rose quickly through the ranks of the buccaneering world. He was not a reckless adventurer. He was a strategic military commander who happened to work for pirates. His raids against Spanish targets were planned with the precision of military campaigns, because that is exactly what they were. In 1668, he took Portobelo, one of the most heavily fortified cities in the Spanish Caribbean. In 1669, he raided Maracaibo in modern-day Venezuela, and in 1671, he did what no privateer had ever attempted at that scale. He marched nearly 1,500 men across the Isthmus of Panama, through jungle, swamp, and Spanish resistance, and attacked Panama City from the landward side. Panama City was one of the richest cities in the Western Hemisphere. Morgan burned it to the ground. The raid was a diplomatic catastrophe. England and Spain had signed the Treaty of Madrid in 1670, in which England agreed to stop authorizing attacks on Spanish possessions. Morgan launched his Panama campaign after the treaty was signed. He claimed he had not received word of the agreement. Nobody believed him. Morgan was arrested, shipped back to England, and put on trial. He was acquitted, then knighted, then sent back to Jamaica as lieutenant governor. Sir Henry Morgan spent his remaining years enforcing the law against the same class of men he had once led. He prosecuted pirates. He hanged some of them. He died in 1688, wealthy and respected, and was buried in the Palisadoes cemetery overlooking the harbor where his career had been built. 4 years later, the sea came for his grave. After Morgan's death, Port Royal began to change. The golden age of state-sponsored piracy was ending. The Treaty of Madrid had removed the legal cover that privateers depended on. Jamaica passed anti-piracy laws in 1687. The new governors were merchants and administrators, not soldier adventurers. They saw greater profit in legitimate trade with Spain than in plundering it. The irony was savage. Port Royal, the city that pirates had built, became the city where pirates were executed. Gallows Point, at the entrance to the harbor, became the preferred location for public hangings. The same waterfront where buccaneers had once been celebrated now displayed their corpses, strung up as warnings to anyone still clinging to the old ways. Charles Vane was hanged there in 1720. Calico Jack Rackham was hanged there the same year. 41 pirates were executed in a single month in 1722. The pirate queen Mary Read died in a Jamaican prison in Spanish Town 5 months after Rackham's execution. Port Royal was still wealthy, still busy, still home to thousands. But the men who had made it famous were now being killed by the city they had enriched. The machine had turned on its creators. And then came Tuesday, June 7th, 1692. The morning was ordinary. The Reverend Emmanuel Heath, the Anglican rector of Port Royal, was finishing a late morning service. He had a lunch appointment at a tavern near the waterfront. A friend convinced him to stay and talk a few minutes longer. That small decision saved his life. At approximately 11:43 in the morning, the ground began to move. It did not shake the way earthquakes usually do. Witnesses described the ground rolling like waves on the ocean. The sand beneath Port Royal, the same sand that the entire city was built on, began to liquefy. 65 feet of water, saturated sand, never a solid foundation to begin with, lost all structural integrity in a matter of seconds. The water table was only 2 feet below the surface. When the earthquake hit, the ground turned to liquid. 3 separate shocks struck within minutes, each more powerful than the last. Modern scientists estimate the earthquake was a magnitude 7.5. Buildings that had stood for decades began to sink, not collapse. Sink. The sand opened beneath them and swallowed them whole. Entire streets slid downward as the liquefied ground flowed out into Kingston Harbour, carrying buildings, people, and everything they owned with it. Fissures cracked open across the city. People fell into them. The fissures snapped shut, crushing victims where they stood. Reverend Heath later wrote that the streets, with their inhabitants, were swallowed up by the opening of the earth, which then shut upon them and squeezed the people to death. Some were buried with their heads still above ground. Dogs ate the exposed heads of the dead before anyone could reach them. 2/3 of Port Royal, roughly 33 acres of densely packed city, sank into the sea within minutes. The northern section of the city simply ceased to exist above the waterline. Fort James and Fort Carlisle, 2 of the 5 fortifications defending the harbor, disappeared entirely beneath the waves. Fort Charles survived, but barely. What had been dry land with buildings and streets was suddenly open water, with the tops of the tallest buildings still visible just below the surface, surrounded by the masts of ships that had sunk alongside them. A tsunami struck shortly after the shaking stopped, pushing a wall of water over the parts of the city that were still above sea level. The HMS Swan, a Royal Navy vessel moored in the harbor, was lifted from the water and deposited on top of a building. Ships in the harbor snapped their anchor cables and were smashed against the wharves or driven inland. The Palisadoes cemetery, where Henry Morgan was buried just 4 years earlier, broke apart and slid into the harbor. Morgan's grave, his body in its lead coffin, sank beneath the waves and has never been found. The survivors described scenes that read like the end of the world. Reverend Heath wrote that the sea rose up and rolled over the northern part of the town, sweeping away everything in its path. People who had escaped the collapsing buildings were caught by the wave and drowned in what had been streets moments before. One account described a man named Louis Galdi, who was swallowed by a fissure in the earth, sucked underground, and then blown back out into the harbor by the force of the water rushing through the subterranean channels. He survived. He washed up alive, battered and half drowned, on the far side of the harbor. His gravestone, which still exists in the Port Royal churchyard, records the event. He lived to be an old man. Almost no one else who went into the ground came back out. 9/10 of the city was covered with water within 2 minutes, according to one contemporary account. The tops of the highest houses were visible in the water and surrounded by the masts of vessels which had been sunk along with them. What had been the busiest commercial port in the English Caribbean was now an underwater ruin, visible through the clear Caribbean water like a drowned ghost of itself. Approximately 2,000 people died in the earthquake and tsunami within the first few minutes. In the days and weeks that followed, another 3,000 died from injuries, disease, and the complete collapse of sanitation and shelter. Yellow fever swept through the survivors. Looters moved through the wreckage within hours of the disaster, stealing from the dead and the dying. The Jamaica Council, surveying the ruins, issued a statement that would echo across the Atlantic. "We are become, by this, an instance of God Almighty's severe judgment." In Boston, the Puritan minister Cotton Mather agreed. He called the destruction of Port Royal a divine message to all of English America. The Catholic Church had condemned Port Royal for years as the wickedest town in Christendom. Now, it seemed, the judgment had arrived. The city that had tolerated pirates, profited from plunder, and celebrated every form of excess had been dragged beneath the sea in a single morning. Whether it was divine judgment or plate tectonics depends on what you believe. What is beyond dispute is that Port Royal was built on sand in every sense of the word. Literally, the city sat on 65 feet of loose, water-saturated sediment that was never capable of supporting the weight placed on it. And figuratively, its economy was built on piracy, a revenue source that the Crown had already begun to dismantle years before the earthquake finished the job. Port Royal was partially rebuilt in the years that followed, but it never recovered. A fire in 1703 destroyed much of the reconstructed town. Hurricanes in 1712, 1722, and 1744 caused further damage. Another devastating earthquake in 1907 liquefied the sandspit once again and sank additional portions of the original city. The survivors of each disaster rebuilt a little less each time, until Port Royal was no longer a city at all. Today, it is a quiet fishing village with a population of less than 2,000 people. Fort Charles still stands at the harbor entrance. A small museum displays artifacts recovered from the sunken city. The streets are quiet. The taverns are gone. But beneath the water of Kingston Harbour, the old city is still there. Underwater archaeologists have been exploring the sunken ruins since the 1950s. What they found was extraordinary. Port Royal beneath the waves is a catastrophic sight, a place where a sudden disaster preserved an entire city exactly as it existed at the moment of destruction. Unlike ancient ruins that decay gradually over centuries, Port Royal was sealed by the sea in an instant. Buildings still stand on the harbor floor, their walls intact, their rooms filled with silt but structurally recognizable. Pewter tableware, Chinese porcelain, glass bottles, clay pipes, iron tools, and personal belongings have been recovered in remarkable condition. The pocket watch that Edwin Link found in 1959 became the most famous artifact. Made in 1686, its hand stopped at 11:43, recording the exact moment the earthquake struck. It is a small object, no larger than a man's palm. But it is also a monument to every person who was alive at 1142 and dead at 1144. A single minute, frozen in brass and glass, pulled from the harbor floor 267 years after Tim stopped. Marion Clayton Link, Edwin's wife and a researcher on the expedition, described what drew them to the site. Unlike cities on land which change with the years, this one remained exactly as it had been more than 2.5 centuries before, sealed by the sea in an instant by the earthquake. Whatever we might find in the ruins would be truly indicative of the time. She was right. Port Royal is an underwater Pompeii. The difference is that Pompeii was a Roman city buried by a volcano. Port Royal was a pirate city buried by the sea. And while Pompeii has been excavated for centuries, much of Port Royal remains untouched beneath 40 feet of water, protected by Jamaican law and awaiting future archaeology. The site has been tentatively listed by UNESCO as a World Heritage Site. The paperwork moves slowly. The city beneath the harbor is patient. It has been waiting since 1692. Port Royal was never just a pirate port. It was a machine for converting violence into wealth, and wealth into pleasure, and pleasure into nothing at all. The pirates who sailed from its harbor took gold from Spanish ships and spent it in Port Royal's taverns within weeks. The tavern keepers used the gold to buy supplies from merchants. The merchants used the gold to buy enslaved people from traders. The enslaved people worked the sugar plantations whose output was shipped through Port Royal's docks to Europe. Every link in the chain was built on exploitation, and every link enriched the city. When the sea swallowed Port Royal, it swallowed all of it: the gold and the chains, the rum and the blood, the brick houses and the bodies inside them, the privateer captains and the enslaved people who served them, the tavern keepers and the prostitutes, and the goldsmiths, and the reverend who was running late for lunch. The city did not discriminate in its dying any more than it had discriminated in its living. Everyone went down together. Henry Morgan's body is still down there somewhere, in a lead coffin that slid off the Palisadoes and into the harbor on the morning the world ended. He had survived battles, storms, jungle crossings, a trial for piracy, and a political career that would have killed a lesser man. He did not survive the sand giving way beneath his grave. Port Royal lasted about 50 years as the wickedest city in the world. It took the Caribbean 3 minutes to erase it, and it left behind a pocket watch, a sunken city, and a question that the preachers answered one way and the geologists answered another. Was it judgment? Or was it just the ground doing what unstable ground eventually does? The sea never answered. It just took the city and kept it. And if you dive down into Kingston Harbour today, past 40 feet of warm Caribbean water, you can still see the walls of the buildings where the richest pirates in the world drank their last rum on a Tuesday morning, before the floor dropped out from under them and the ocean rushed in. If you want to hear the stories of what else the sea has taken and never returned, subscribe. There's always another ship that never came home.